So the format of this webinar is I will cover in the first half, I'll cover the changes and improvements to version control, to refactoring, to code generation, the decompiler and debugger, and some of the small changes and additions to the editor. In the second half of the webinar, Breandan's going to cover some of the changes and improvements to frameworks and libraries like Android and Spring and the Docker integration. The first thing I want to show is some of the new changes to version control. The first thing you'll probably notice, the first thing that stood out to me as an IntelliJ user, is that now there's only a single tab, which is called version control. There used to be a version control one and a changes one, which I found a little bit confusing. Now there's only a single tab there, which you can click on to get to everything to do with version control. So here I can see my local changes and my log, where I can see all the commits which have gone into my version control. One of the things I want to talk about here is in this particular project, I've actually got two VCS routes. I've got one going to Bitbucket and I've got one going to GitHub for reasons that are too boring to go into. If you click here to the left of the commits and this out, you can see which commits go to which VCS routes. And on the paths button here, if I click this, I can choose to hide one of those, or if I had more than one, hide more than one. So I can select which ones are visible. So this gives me a bit more visibility over exactly what's going on with my version control for a particular project. The next thing I want to show you, I can show you in this project because all the commits are in my name. But if I move to a slightly different project, I can show you the highlight your own commits. So if I turn on highlight my commits, on here we can see in a sort of yellowy color, these are all the commits that I made to this particular project. So this is quite a good way of finding things like obviously specific commits that you made, but also sort of seeing maybe how many of other people's commits have been in since the last time you committed. So I think that's kind of super useful in a normal project that you're collaborating on with a number of other developers. In other changes for version control is, if you remember, if you've used this before, you can annotate a class with the revisions that apply to each of the lines of code. So, for example, I can see this line of code is changed here by me, and if I scroll up to the top, I can see that other changes from other people. In 14.1, one of the changes that we made is that these changes are color-coded. So old changes are kind of red or shades of red, and newer ones, as we can see, are in shades of green. The ones which are kind of in between are in a sort of purpley kind of color, I guess. So if I want, I can right-click on one of these changes, and I can open up this particular revision, this specific revision, and annotate that as well. So if I click on this, then I can see this is the thing, this is the change I made. I added this particular method with its javadoc because it's a good idea to javadoc public methods. I also see the state of the rest of the file, particular date and time. You might also have noticed that there was another option there, which was annotate previous revision. Now, it might not be immediately obvious what that's useful for, but if I look up here, I've got two changes back to back. One seems to affect the white space and one seems to affect the methods. And if I look at them, this one that affects the white space looks like probably it was just a formatting revision. So I probably don't want to have a look at that because it's probably just white space and indentation and so forth. So for this one, I probably want to annotate the previous revision to see the more significant change that happened before then. So here I can see, well, you can see that there's some white space changes and the fact that all these methods have been moved around quite a lot. The last thing I want to show you with the version control changes is there's a new mode for the diff tool. So if I go and check if I try and show the diff between the changes I've made, traditionally we had this sort of spice diff. We have the old file on the left and the new file on the right, and I have to sort of scroll sideways to see what my change were. In this particular case, what I did is I added a generic parameter for the. In many cases, this is kind of useful, and I think lots of people don't mind the side-by-side diff. But there's a new viewer where we can pick the one-side viewer, and here we can see the original line of code, or certainly the previous line of code at the top here, and the new line of code directly underneath it with the specific changes highlighted in a kind of more green, if you like. So this gives us a bit more flexibility over how we see the diffs between the previous version of the file and the new version. What I'd like to do now is move on to the change in refactoring. So let's this project, because I'm done with that. Let's open up a refactoring project. So one of the things I think is really cool about IntelliJ IDEA 14.1 is that although there are some new refactorings, and I'll show you one of them in a minute, the existing refactorings that we use all the time have actually just got a lot smarter. So for example, extract method. If I wanted to extract this method in a previous version of IntelliJ, it would pull out that line of code and put it into a method, and that's great. But what it couldn't do then was figure out that the line above is actually very similar to that line, but not exactly the same. And just a small change in the method signature will allow us to reuse that. Let me demonstrate that. So if I pull this out into a method, then let's call this print. In the new version of IntelliJ, let's make this a bit bigger so we can see it better. What IntelliJ suggests to me is that maybe if I stick this string in as a parameter, then maybe I'll be able to replace more instances of code with this new method. So I'm going to accept that signature change. I'm going to replace this one at the top as well. So it's found another place where I can use that method. So let's replace that. I don't know if you can see, but right at the bottom of my screen, it's showing which shortcuts I'm using for doing things like extract method. I'm on Windows, so I'm using the Windows ones, but at the bottom it'll show you the Windows and the Mac bindings as well. The Windows ones are usually very similar to the Linux ones, so I'm not ignoring the Linux guys. So also another extract method change is if we want to extract this one, here I have a method, an instance method, and here I have a static method. If I extract this, let's extract method again, let's call it print. It offers me the same again. It wants me to pull this out into a parameter. So that's fine, that's the same thing I've just demonstrated. And it's up that I can replace this one with the new method call, but it needs to turn it into a static method if it does that. So if I replace that, it figures out this new method needs to be a static method, but that's okay because it doesn't really impact either of these two places that call that method. So with the extract method, IntelliJ IDEA is just being a little bit smarter about some of the places where there might be duplicate code which in a slightly different shape could use these methods that we've extracted. But it's not just extracting methods that's been changed. It's so called hierarchy as well. So if, for example, if we change the shape of the method, if we change the method parameters, we can also figure out some smarter things to do. So I'm going to add a parameter to this method. Here what we've got is a method called foo, which calls bar, a method called bar, which calls baz, and a method called baz, which does nothing. But obviously this is a massively oversimplified example. But imagine if you had a multi-tiered architecture. It's not unusual to find a call hierarchy where, say, a method in your service layer calls a method in your DAO layer, which calls another method somewhere else. And so you might have a stack of method calls throughout your hierarchy. Now, let's say you want to add a parameter to this baz method. I'm going to add an int parameter. I'm going to call it I because, no, I'm not going to call it integer because it's a good idea to call parameters something useful. That's fine. And apparently there's a feature, an underused feature in IntelliJ which has been around for a while, which is this propagate parameters feature. So if I click that, it gives me the option to propagate this parameter from baz all the way up through bar and through foo. So if I select foo, it will add that parameter to all of those methods. So that I'm going to refactor that. And now you can see I've got this integer parameter on all of my methods. So that's fine. Apparently that's been around for a little while. It's not something I was aware of. One of the changes that's coming in 14.1 though is if I want, for example, to now delete this parameter because it's unused, I'm going to delete it with Alt-Delete. IntelliJ IDEA detects that it can also delete it from the call hierarchy as well. So I can click foo and it'll be removed from all of those methods. Great. The same thing works if I want to make this method static. So I'll refactor, make it static, refactor that, and IntelliJ asks me if I want to make all of those methods static, which I do. And then finally, this method foo is not being used, not surprisingly because it's an example. But let's say our top level method isn't being used anymore and we want to delete that. Then IntelliJ IDEA figures out that we can delete all of those methods because they're only used in this call hierarchy. So that's some quite nice changes to the way refactoring works inside IntelliJ IDEA. We don't really need to learn that many new things. It's just IntelliJ IDEA is going to suggest additional things to you when you're trying to refactor things that perhaps it didn't suggest to you before. Now I want to show you one of the really cool things I think in IntelliJ IDEA 14.1. I need a different project for this because, you know, this is all in one project. It would be far too boring. So I want to show you how to extract a functional parameter. Now we're all using Java 8, right? Or thinking about Java 8 as if we're Java people. Then we're starting to think in terms of more functional patterns. So we're not just talking about passing around objects or passing around like a Boolean value here or an int value there. We might be passing around functions. So we might be passing around lambdas. So IntelliJ IDEA's refactoring has changed to help us do this as well. So let's say we want to, what I've got here is I've got a method which does 3 very similar things depending on different criteria. So I'm going to do this if it's sad, this if it's happy, this if it's confused. Now, that looks kind of like a ripe place for refactoring because I'm repeating code. So let's try and refactor this. Let's call it increment pi. So I've got this method increment pi. Let's just do some sort of standard refactorings like I'm going to extract this parameter, if I can spell. I'm going to extract this into a parameter as well. Let's call that pi slice. Now IntelliJ works out that this code can be replaced with this method call. And this one too. Fine, great. So we've reduced code duplication and pulled out a single method. That's great. But what we might want to do is just go one step further. Maybe we want to do something a little bit more generic than this. Maybe we want this to be like a do if method, and we want it to do some functionality based on some criteria. So what I want to do is pull this out into a lambda. Now I can do that with Control, Shift, Alt, P. It's one extra button to press to extract the parameter, the functional parameter. So I'm trying to extract this as a functional parameter. IntelliJ IDEA suggests a number of functional interfaces which have got the right signature for this particular call. So this takes no arguments and it returns void. So it's suggesting these functional interfaces. And maybe I could use runnable, that's fine, but maybe I decide that runnable is a little bit too generic for me. So what I want is my own interface. So let's have an interface. Let's call it incrementable. Well, let's give it a increment method. We need to tag this under Java 8. We should tag this as a functional interface. Now, when I try and extract this as a functional parameter, it offers me incrementable as a valid functional parameter. So let's do that. Let's pull this out. Now you'll see what IntelliJ has done is put this in as an anonymous in a class. And that's kind of fine because actually that means we can apply this even in non-Java 8 code. So we can use this in Java 6 code if we want to, especially if, say, we're not using Java 8 yet, but we're trying to refactor our code to a more functional style before we get there, then maybe we want to move this way. I mean, there's a lot of boilerplate there. So if we are using Java 8, then what we can do is use some of IntelliJ's inspections for helping make our code a little bit more succinct. For example, in this case, I'm going to use a method reference because I think that's kind of the shortest way to represent this. But you don't have to use a method reference. You could, for example, say, refactor this to a lambda. So I can use it either as a lambda or as a method reference. So that's IntelliJ IDEA's support for pulling out functional parameters so that you can start passing bits of behavior around and not just objects. I think that's a really interesting feature here in the new version of the IDE. As well as refactorings, we've also got some changes in code generation. I sort of see these two things as going quite hand in hand because both of these things are the IDE sort of taking over some of the boring stuff that you don't want to do, and just allowing you to get on with a more interesting bit of coding. So let's take, for example, equals and hash code. Let me find let me know that's not work. Let me find something an equals and hash on. I've got a simple Pojo, so this is a Twitter user. It's got a series of properties. Now, let's say I want to add an equals method onto this. I can use my generate equals and hash code. Now, normally, I might use the IntelliJ default. So let's have a look at that. Let's use that IntelliJ default. Let's make those all non-null. And IntelliJ generates the equals method. Now, personally, I'm a big fan of having curly braces around my ifs, so I kind of want it to look a bit like this. But my generated code doesn't look the way I want my code to look. So I can change the templates for my generated code so that it meets my requirements. So let's just back that out and try again. So this time, we're going to insert our equals and hash code. We can select one of these or existing defaults, or what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my own template. So I'm going to copy the default one here. We'll call it, I don't know, project default. And what I want to do is I'm going to go to one of these macros. This row is the field comparison that it was just using to generate that equals method. So I want to put curly braces around my ifs. Now, you'll notice I actually don't need to format this correctly. I can actually just kind of put my braces more or less wherever I want to. And when IntelliJ inserts this code, it will format the code according to your standards. So let's say I make those changes. I'm going to rename this so that I know this is the one I changed, and also to demonstrate another feature to you. So if I go up to where this is called, you can see that actually IntelliJ is giving you some code hints even inside this templates box. So it's telling me there's no longer a macro called add field comparison. So what I can do is I can look for something which is right. So I want project field comparison. So I get my autocomplete even inside this templates. So let's see, I've created this project default. I've changed my default so it puts curly braces in there. So that should be everything I want to do. Let's click through, click all of these. Now when I get my generated code, I've got curly braces in my generated equals code. So this is quite a nice feature for us, especially if we want our code to follow particular guidelines. We can have the code generation follow our guidelines as well. We don't just have to put up with whatever gets inserted into our code. Next up, I've just got two more areas I want to show you. So next up, I'm going to move on to the decompiler and debugging. So in IntelliJ IDEA 14, let's bring up a test class. In IntelliJ IDEA 14, we had quite a lot of improvements in both the debugging area, and we had this idea of the built-in decompiler. So if I drill through to code that I don't own, so for example, here I haven't actually attached sources. IntelliJ is telling me it's quite small text, and it's quite difficult to see, but this is a decompiled class file. So it's making, based on the bytecode, it's kind of giving me readable code so I can understand what's going on. Now, this was available in IntelliJ 14, but in 14.1, I can actually add my own breakpoints in here and step through and debug this as if it were almost my own code that I owned. So it gives me a lot more visibility even over the code that isn't mine as I'm trying to figure out maybe a particular problem or trying to figure out exactly how something works. So I'll put a breakpoint in here. Let's go back to my test. And if I start running this, let's start debugging it rather than running it. We can see the debugger doing what it's supposed to do. So I really liked the new debugging features in version 14 anyway. I think this was in 14.1, we got these new buttons as well, so everything's all kind of shiny and new. So let's step into where we're debugged. Here we're stepping into the decompiled class file, so I can step in and keep looking at stuff. Or what I'm going to run to my breakpoint. And here I can see again my inline debugging that we got in IntelliJ 14 is available inside here. So I can see the actual value was 1, the expected value was 2, and this is the string description that we're going to get. So this is definitely going to fail. So I can see why it's failing and what the values were. So the final thing I want to look at is I want to show some of the general changes to the overall editor. So let's final project. In a number of changes which just make our lives as developers just that little bit easier. So for example, they've changed things like the look and feel of the tabs. So let's have a look at the tabs here. Let's spell tabs correctly. I'm having a bad spelling day today. So let's put the tabs at the top. And so if I open another tab here, they slightly change the feel of it. So that's just a tiny enhancement. And speaking of which, you can sort of see that when you've got a lot of these things open, you've got your tabs open, and you've got this window open, and you've got a bunch of buttons around the sides. There's a lot of stuff getting in the way, getting in between you and your actual code. So one of the new modes is distraction. So I can enter distraction-free mode, and that just gets rid of all that clutter, and I can just focus on just my code. I still get useful information like which lines of code I've changed, and I have things like some of the errors are available on the side. I can still code the way I expect to. And speaking of which, I'm going to use this mode to demonstrate some of the new features. So in HTML, it's quite easy to change one tag and forget to change the closing tag. I mean, IntelliJ will at least tell you that you're missing a closing tag, but it's very easy to make these sorts of simple mistakes. In 14.1, new setting, simultaneous tag editing. So if I turn that on, set that to OK, now if I change this, then my closing tag gets changed as well. So I can do that here. So I know that my HTML is well formed no matter what changes I'm making to the tabs. I think that's a really nice way just to stop us making silly mistakes, which are so easy to make. And the last feature that I want to show, let's say I put 2 more divs in here. Now I can create 2 cursors in my code by pressing Shift and Alt and then selecting with the mouse. And I can select with both of those cursors. And I can, for example, now cut with both of those cursors. And then if I create another 2 cursors down here, I'll put a space in there. I can paste those 2 different values into the 2 new positions of the cursors. Now, I think this is really useful for doing things like string manipulation and moving stuff around inside the code, so that you can, I don't know, maybe neaten up your code or maybe extract parameters from concrete strings. I think that's all I had to cover. So I've covered version control, I've covered the new refactoring capabilities, I've covered code generation, I've covered debugging decompiled code, and I've covered some of the changes to the editor. So we're going to switch over to Breandan presenting his half of the webinar, and in the meantime, maybe we can field some of the questions as well while we do the handover.
That was great, Trisha. I really like the extract functional parameter. I think I'll be using that refactoring a lot. I think that's pretty cool.
I think that's my new favorite. I think I'm going to use that a lot in the future.
Yeah. So we have a bunch of questions, and Trisha will continue answer them in the webinar screen. And I'll switch over to my screen now. And I'll be demonstrating 3 new framework and technologies that you'll find in IntelliJ IDEA 14.1. These are by no means comprehensive, but I think they highlight some of the really great features for framework support. And first we'll go over Spring Boot. So there's new improvements for Spring Boot support, and we'll talk about how you can deploy an application really easily with Docker. And finally, we'll discuss some new improvements to Android support in the latest version of IntelliJ IDEA. So we'll hold the questions to the end, and we'll get straight into it. I have a new Spring Boot project set up. And we'll quickly go over how to set a new Spring Boot project up using the wizard. So there's now a Spring Boot initializer wizard to help you get up and running with Spring Boot. So you can configure all of the initialization options for this project. If you're using a Maven or a Gradle-based build, you'll be able to tell it right here in the wizard and give it a packaging option, a language, and so forth. And you'll need to select a subset of core dependencies or technology verticals that you'd like to use inside your Spring Boot application. And what Spring Boot does is it makes it really easy to use the conventions in Spring without having to do a whole lot of configuration. So whether you're using this to quickly prototype maybe a backend RESTful web service, or say a user-facing web application or something else, you can select those dependencies that you'd like to import. And what the initializer wizard will do is it will configure your Maven POM or Gradle build script to use all of the correct versions for these technologies and set those up for you. And so you can select the ones you'd like and Spring Boot version. And I think Spring Boot 1.3 was recently released just this week. And you can use all of that, and it'll pull down the project template from start.spring.io, and you'll be able to use that right inside your IDE. And so this is now integrated right inside IntelliJ IDEA, and it helps kind of quickly go from the conception of what technologies you'd like to use to a working project in just a few simple steps. And this is a great feature in Spring Boot and now in IntelliJ IDEA as well. But the support doesn't end there. You can go into your Spring Boot application, and you may not know this, but you can edit your property files now with complete code assistance inside the editor. And this is really thoughtfully done, I think. So there's code completion for new property keys. So if you don't know the fully qualified name for the key, you can just type a substring and select from the code completion. And there's completion in the value as well. Additionally, there's navigation support between these properties and their associated property sources in Java. So these correspond to setters that you can specify, whether it's something inside the Spring dependencies, the starter dependencies, or a custom property that you can define on your own. So if there's a property that's not defined, we can start writing our own my custom property. And it automatically does the validation against these keys, and it says, well, this property isn't available. We can define the configuration key, and it'll automatically create that inside this JSON file. Additionally, when you deploy this to either your local development machine, there's new configuration options in the run and debug configurations. So you'll find a new Spring Boot run and debug configuration here, and you'll be able to override these parameters and specify any active profiles you're using for Spring Beans. So I can override a number of parameters right inside this run and debug configuration. And again, there's code completion in here as well. So what we try to do is kind of remove any obstacles so that you don't have to look all these things up or muck around in XML or anything like that. So that's very helpful. So if we'd like to go ahead and run this, what Spring Boot does is it provides a built-in application server. So all you need to do is just run the application, and it will deploy it to a local instance of our Java, our JVM, and then we'll be able to run it and hit the endpoint from our browser. So this is all well and good. If you want to just quickly prototype an application, we've seen how you can get right into it with new technologies and things like this. But let's say you'd like to go from implementation to execution. If you'd like to deploy this to production somewhere, and you'll be able to do that with Docker. So if you've heard of Docker, Docker is a platform for managing your builds and allowing you to deploy them anywhere in the world in a reproducible fashion. So this is really easy to do with IntelliJ IDEA 14. We've introduced a new plugin for Docker, and with Spring Boot, this works just great. So you can edit this configuration, and you'll be able to specify a Docker server. I've set up a Docker server already. This is a very easy process to do. You can go into your settings and install Docker and give it the Docker endpoint on your local machine or on a remote instance. And you'll need to give it a Docker file as well. I've set up a Docker file inside my working directory here. And what this will do is we'll just take this artifact and deploy it to a running instance of Docker. So let's give that a shot right now. We'll take a look inside our run screen here, and it looks like that this Spring application is running and it's set up correctly. So let's stop this and try this Docker deployment. So the first thing we provide for Docker support is an application server's view. So in Docker, you have your Docker host, and when you're deploying, it will be deployed to an image, and this image may have a number of containers that are running inside your Docker host. And so you'll be able to view the logs. You don't have to connect to it through SSH or anything like that. You can do it right inside your application server's view here. And there's a log for all of these events. So I already have one running container, and let's check out the log here. You can view the processes inside your Docker container, and this should match the running processes if I were to SSH into my Docker instance here and run Docker yes, then I'll get the same information just inside a nice compact view here. And it looks like you'll see the logs as well. So instead of tailing the log on your command line, then you can do it right here. This is the entirety of Docker support right now. However, we do plan on iterating on that and introducing more support for debugging. If you need to do debugging, you can specify a debugging port in your run configuration, and it will give you some parameters you can pass in to Docker when you run the application. Okay, so that's two features kind of for going from idea to implementation to execution, just on a simple Spring Boot project. And so you'll find that the features that we provide for a lot of these frameworks are kind of thoughtfully crafted to help you develop your application with as little friction as possible. So we kind of try to anticipate your workflow as you're going through these events at developing your application, and provide these features. And they may not be apparent at first, but once you're familiar with them, you'll feel right at home. I want to switch gears now to talk about Android development. And we'll close this project and open a new one. And so in Android, Android support just got a whole lot better with unit testing. So this was a kind of a long-awaited feature for many Android developers, and now you can run your unit tests right on the IDE. So this is the primary benefit of using IntelliJ IDEA 14.1. And now there's a new build variants tool window. On your left-hand side, you'll see the build variants window. You can open and close that. And if you're running instrumentation tests, then you know that it has to deploy to the device, and sometimes that's kind of slow and clunky. And so if you want to get on board with TDD, test-driven development, you want these tests to run very quickly. So I have my my instrumentation test here, and this, if I deploy this, this will run on my device. I've connected an Android device, and that will run, and it will check that this message is displayed when I click the button. However, I can do the same thing inside my IDE by switching to the unit testing feature. And this is experimental still, but you can enable this feature under your settings. And you need to be running the latest version of the Android build tool. So 1.1, Android Gradle plugin, 1.1.0 or newer. And you can just enable unit testing support here. And then what you'll be able to do is go to your unit tests, and you'll be able to run these directly. So whenever you want to test a method inside your main activity or one of the activities inside your application, you can just press Control-Shift-T. And look, if you want to test this method, then you can either choose an existing test class or create a new one. And that will be created inside this test directory for JUnit. Okay, so it already contains this test. And we'll add that new test to there. So what I'd like to do right now is I'll run this unit test locally, and just to show you that it works. So I can run this right from my IDE, and it will execute it fairly quickly without having to go to the device to deploy the APK, and you can take advantage of the incremental compilation that's inside Android build tools to make this fairly quick. Let's minimize this while we're waiting, and I'll show you some other new features in Android. So the next feature that we're introducing in IntelliJ IDEA 14 is the ability to quickly create watch faces with a little template. So if you select where, you can create a new watch face template and choose whether analog or digital. And that will create a fully functioning watch face inside your sources. So you can use that to understand how watch faces work and deploy that directly to a device and iterate on that to kind of customize it and so forth. So this is a new template that's available for you to use. And there's also a watch face wizard inside your new project creation. So if you create a new Android project, then you'll be able to give it some watch face related information. Okay, so it looks like our Gradle build is still refreshing. Let's check our test to see if they've finished running. Okay, so this test looks like it's still running, but it'll complete fairly soon. And this is all running inside my IDE. In order to get this to work, you just have to remember to add some information to your build.gradle file. And these test compile dependencies will inform the IDE, inform Gradle that it will need to import those for the test compile phase, and that will happen directly on the IDE. We can also test JUnit here once the Gradle import finishes, and we'll be able to run these simple tests that will you can test that it fails, and then implement the behavior, and then the test should succeed. So those are the three features that we wanted to demonstrate for you today. Spring Boot with Docker, and now Android and Android Wear support. So there are a number of other frameworks that are supported in IntelliJ IDEA, and we offer support for all of those frameworks in the same manner. So we try to look at all the comprehensive features we can include to make your development lifecycle a little bit easier, and give that to you. So this is available in IntelliJ IDEA Community Edition, and Spring Boot is a feature that's available in IntelliJ IDEA Ultimate. So we'd like to go to questions now. So if there are any questions, we can field them right now. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Breandan. I really like the fact that IntelliJ is now supporting beta testing for Android. I think that I kind of work very vaguely on the periphery of the Android space, and it definitely seems to be an area that's been a bit frustrating for developers.
Yeah, it was something that it took a lot of effort to kind of pain and consternation to kind of configure beforehand. I mean, if you're running roboelectric electric tests, then you have to do a whole lot of configuration inside your build script. But now there's direct support inside the IDE, which is fantastic. And when it works great.
There was one question which was specific about your demo, which was on the JSON file with the properties. It said, well, the question is specifically, what was that JSON file with the properties? It went by too quickly. Do you know which one I was talking about? Right, must be that one. I thought I was going deaf, but I don't think we can hear Breandan anymore.
Oh.
Oh, there we are.
Yeah, so those values will be defined inside of your JSON file here, and they're kind of automatically validated as you type. So if you introduce a new value, then and you can just quickly create that. You can define a configuration key that will be introduced in the properties, and you can go ahead and do something with that inside of. If you add another class called configuration properties, then you'll be able to use those values that you set. Let's see, any other questions?
The only other question I can see is that we can't hear you, but now we can hear you. So, oh, here we go. Are there any changes that relate specifically to Grails development? I didn't see anything about Grails, did you?
I didn't in the change list, but I know that's something that that Spring Boot is continuing to support, and you can learn more about Spring Boot and all of this stuff in a webinar that took place yesterday, in fact, and this webinar will be available for you to watch today. So I highly recommend that. Our friend Stefan Nicole will share with you all the latest information about Boot and Grails and the development side of things from Pivotal's point of view. So I definitely check that out. That webinar, Introduction to Spring Boot. That's available later today.
Great. Here we go. Any new updates on the high DPI UI support? As Trisha mentioned, some text is small and unreadable. From my point of view, I'm using Windows on a HDPI screen, and that has definitely improved in 14.1. I'm using that's kind of, well, I'm not showing my screen right now, so I'm using the new updated version. It's definitely better than it was. I believe there's probably still some work going on in there. It's definitely an area for that's getting a lot of attention. Are there any more questions?